Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of News from a World in Flux. I'm Charlie Gardner. I'm a conservation scientist and activist with Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, and I'm with
Clare Farrell. I'm one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion.
So in this show we try to just chat about issues in the climate and nature space that aren't getting the attention they deserve, and one of those is the impact that this incredibly wet and quite cold spring and summer has been having on the world around us. How's your summer been, Claire?
Well, grey, rainy. I don't know when. By the time this goes out, it might have warmed up a bit, but it's not. People have been a bit unimpressed, I think, by this summer so far. And when we arrived here to do this filming together today, we were talking about butterflies, and I actually thought on reflection, I don't think I've seen any at all. Like usually you see some, not many. I live in London, but I just haven't seen any. And yeah, I don't know. Is it more noticeable to other people? Do you think that there's no bugs, there's no pollinators, there's no bees, there's no...
It's a real worry. So it's all over social media. I've been seeing people from all over the country, you know, posting videos of their gardens and their bushes, which are normally full of butterflies and bumblebees and things, just completely empty. And it's difficult to know what's going on. Yeah, I've found this change extraordinary. So my wife's a professional gardener. We have this lovely garden in the countryside, not in a city. We garden without chemicals. We plant for pollinators, and yet there's just been nothing. So we're in the middle of July now. It was really wet through the spring, and I think lots of people were thinking, they just haven't emerged yet. When the weather gets better, they'll come out and we'll see them. But then we did have this nice, really warm, sunny spell in June, and the butterflies and bees didn't come out. And I think that's when people really started to worry. It's difficult to know what it means because it's just happening right now, and so there's been no research on it. Maybe some of these species will emerge later in the summer. Maybe they will recover and bounce back next year. We just don't know. But it looks like there's really something going on this year and last year too, to an extent. And it's worrying, and it's really interesting. It'll be really interesting to see once the research comes out what's causing these impacts. So we know that there have been massive declines in flying insects over the last few years, and that's largely about how we manage the land. It's about agriculture, it's about use of pesticides and herbicides which wipe out all the wildflowers that they feed on. And there's been lots of data over the last few years on these massive insect declines. So there was that famous study from Germany that came out about 4 or 5 years ago where they found that there had been like 70% declines in flying insect numbers just in 17 years, so really rapid. People talk about that study a lot, but what's interesting about that, which people often don't talk about, is that data was all collected in nature reserves. So that's not 70% declines of pollinating insects over the general landscape. It's in nature reserves, in the places that we've set aside for nature. And that's really worrying because it shows that this whole model of, we can just conserve biodiversity by just,
doing it a bit in a little place there, just there.
We'll put 10% of our land in some parks and reserves here and there, and that'll be enough. But clearly it's not, because what's happening in the landscape around those is having such big impacts that it's even affecting the species that live in reserves. So that's a real worry. So we have this background decline in pollinating insects, but what's happened this year seems to be a a big acceleration on that. It doesn't just seem to be a continuation of that. It's a bigger change, and it'll be really interesting to see, to find out what's causing it. But to my mind, and I'm not a pollination ecologist, but to my mind, it's climate change. And I think it's, when we think about the impacts that climate change is having on our weather in the UK, you would of course expect it to have massive impacts. In our last episode, we were talking about farming, and we were talking about how the weather means, unseasonal heat waves, frosts that come at the wrong time, really wet weather at the wrong time, or hailstorms at the wrong time, or whatever. And every species we have in this country is adapted to a particular set of conditions. And they breed at a particular time because they know that their food source is going to be available at the moment when their caterpillars hatch or whatever. And everything is changing so fast. So to my mind, I think that must be having a massive impact on our insect population. So 3 summers ago we had 40-degree heat. That's just never happened before. None of our plant and insect species that we have are adapted to 40-degree heat. There's some talk that the really cool and dull weather we have over the spring has impacted the ability of flowers to produce nectar. They need sun to produce nectar, so there's less food for insects. I wonder if the really rainy conditions might have affected their breeding too. But really, I think it's death by 1,000 cuts, isn't it? They're suffering so many different things at the same time. They're being systematically poisoned across the landscape. They're having their habitats destroyed, and then the seasonality which they're adapted to is just gone completely haywire. So it's worrying times for biodiversity, for nature, and it's been really worrying for me. Really, I found it scary on a sort of rational, conceptual level when you think about what having no pollinators might do to our food supplies in the future and things. But I also just found it desperately sad, actually, really, really sad to be in my garden, this space we've created for nature, and for there to be no nature there because it's being wiped out. And it's really hit me this summer, and it's hit a lot of people. So as a conservationist, I've spent my whole life being aware of the declines in nature, and read a million articles about how nature is declining in other places. But to see it with your own eyes and to notice a change from year on year, that's the really scary thing. How rapid these changes are, that you can notice it from year to year. Because normally biodiversity declines are quite slow. I mean, they're fast on an ecological timescale, but they're slow on a human timescale. You don't notice a 1 or 2% decline in a population every year, but when things just aren't there from one year to the next, it's really scary. So I hesitate to say too much about it because it's happening right now. We don't know. Next year they might all be back. They might all come out later. So I don't want to draw too much inference just from what's been happening over the last few weeks all over the country. But it is deeply, deeply worrying.
So from one deeply worrying conversation to the next thing on our list to talk about today is injunctions. And there's been a lot of focus, through the movement, but also increasingly in the media actually, about the legal situation around people's rights to protest, to assemble, to take up public space, to disrupt or not, or to make a noise or not. And I think, one of the things that a lot of people don't really know very much about, and perhaps we haven't done a good enough job as a movement of popularising as a conversation, but it has gone up the news agenda, is this idea of injunctions. And what injunctions really mean, not only for activists and the people who are on the receiving end of the sort of, the impact of what they're designed to do, but what they also do in a sort of on a social and political level. Because the injunctions that have been served over the last few years are not a new phenomenon. So for people who don't know what they are, an injunction is basically a private legal order that is commissioned and paid for by an individual or a company in order to prevent other people from doing something that they don't want them to do. And there's always been a use of injunctions for a long time in the anti-protest and in an anti-democratic sense. So going way back from fossil fuel companies to try and protect their infrastructure, for example, to say, well, the land around it is injuncted, so therefore if you come onto it, you can get arrested for breaching a court order, not for trespass or for any criminal charge. So there's no need to establish any criminality in the person being in the place because they've broken a court order.
Yeah.
That's what you've done wrong. And so if the evidence basically shows that you were there and it was injuncted land, there's not really a trial to be had. There's only a trial to be had to decide what your penalty should be.
Right.
Now, in addition to that, what it also means is that you are in the civil courts, you're not in the criminal courts. And this is also a really important difference. Once you're in the civil courts, as some of our friends know only too well, you can be given often an unlimited fine. Your assets can be seized in a way that the criminal system can't do to you very easily. And you also can get sent straight to prison. So it's quite like, do not collect £200, go straight to prison. And you can buy that if you're rich or if you're a rich company. I was recently invited on a sort of Sunday morning TV show to talk about injunctions, and unfortunately the conversation was not about injunctions. It was just about what gives you the right to do a protest that's annoying, which was very frustrating actually, because I did want to talk about injunctions properly. So we've got a list of topics here that I just want to raise. So whilst I was trying to work out what to say on that show, which I didn't get to say because the conversation wasn't really about injunctions, was firstly this, what this whole setup is basically a sort of what a lawyer that I know, Raj, has said is a private system of justice. Basically, you can buy it; it's enclosed. You or I don't have the kind of money that BP or Shell or Exxon or any of these other big companies would have to be able to employ these very expensive lawyers to put these very expensive things in place. What Raj said in the news a little while ago, whilst he was invited to comment on it, which I thought was very interesting, was this, not that it's new because people have done it for a long time to try and keep people out of interfering with their business interests, but the scale of them, which has just gone completely off the charts. And I can only assume that, the reason why we've seen such a rapid increase at the same time as we've seen this huge sort of push back against people's civil liberties and huge crackdown on people's freedom to protest in the UK, those things happening in conjunction with one another are very much part of the same sort of truth of the times that we're in. It is becoming untenable to reasonably promote the extraction of fossil fuels, new licensing, or even to really defend the continued use of some of the infrastructure. So, the law and the crackdown on the protesters, both from a private perspective, from private money perspective, and from the state perspective, it's all coming down on the people who are trying the hardest to, make the change that we need to happen. And one of the things that someone said to me recently, which was so interesting, was about Sarah Ben. And I don't know.
The doctor.
Yeah, and I don't know if you listened to the BBC radio documentary it's about Sarah, and it's also about the medics who went on trial for Extinction Rebellion for cracking the windows of JP Morgan. I really recommend listening to it. It's actually, it's a very good, it's an unusually very, very thorough, good, long form piece of content about these people going through this experience of the trial, but also what Sarah went through. And what Sarah Ben did was go out on a grass verge with a sign, and that grass verge was part of the land belonging to a fossil fuel company that had injuncted it, and she got arrested because she was in breach of a court order. Really, she was stood on a grass verge, but she was breaking the law because they'd put a special law in place. So then when she went back and did it again, she eventually ended up being remanded in custody, along with quite a lot of other people. I think something like about 50 people have been served time in prison because of that single injunction, just that one.
Wow.
And then, if anyone's been following this, you'll know that Sarah then, was struck off by the General Medical Council, and I think it's a suspension rather than a sort of all-out being struck off, but it's a huge price to pay to say, I'm going to go and take this action, and we could lose the family home, I could lose my job, and I could do time in prison, and all of that is for holding a sign like that.
Yep.
So these kinds of actions have really sort of, I think they really are beginning to highlight something very important for people to realise about the reality of what's in place to try and prevent anything from changing. And I guess the last thing that I want to say on this, which I think almost nobody knows about because I didn't know until I was doing my research, try and be ready to go on the media and talk about injunctions, was that there's someone in our movement, I won't name them, but when you get an injunction from a company, and I know that they still pour into the inboxes for people in the climate movement from different individual companies. The lawyers must be making an absolute killing out of this, by the way. But when those injunctions arrive, they often have people named on them. And then they have this really dodgy line that says, and persons unknown, including persons unknown. So basically, anyone who may or may not be aware that this is an injuncted bit of land could find themselves on an area that is being, covered by one of these injunctions, and then find themselves arrested for breaching a court order, and then find themselves facing the repercussions of that. And if you're a named person on that injunction, and I know this has happened to somebody in Extinction Rebellion, but you don't break the order because you say, I don't want to, I can't afford to lose my home, or whatever, that person who doesn't then go and break the order, whilst other people who are named do decide to go and break the order on purpose, that person is now receiving relentless letters telling them that they owe money on the fines because someone else broke it.
How can any system of justice hold someone responsible for the actions of someone else? That's absurd. I
do not know. And I think, it must be arguable. But I mean, it's pretty intimidating and it's extremely stressful, I think, receiving this stuff in the post. I know people who've broken injunctions and, boxes of paperwork that gets delivered to your house. It's just reams and reams and reams of documentation, papers. It's extremely stressful, and it comes with this enormous cost. And of course, if you lose your case, which is very likely, because if you do break the injunction and you're photographed there or filmed there by the police, then they're just going to say, well, here's the court order, here's you are there, if you are there and you're not meant to be, then you're in breach of this injunction. Therefore, you're basically straight away guilty. There's no conversation to have about it. Now, all we're going to talk about is like, what should be the repercussions for you? And then your fate is basically in the hands of a judge who just decides what to do with you. That's what your trial really is about, you know. And friends of mine who went on trial for breaking injunctions during Insulate Britain and served time in prison, you know, they just really were going to court to find out what they were going to do with them, not whether or not they were guilty or whether or not they should be found guilty of anything. But it is hard to imagine, isn't it, how can you have a system set up where you can have all of this stuff piled on your doorstep and sent to your family home and threaten you with all of the above, and to do so on the grounds that someone else did something and you didn't even show up, right? I mean,
that's crazy.
I guess I'll find out what happens with this person and try to bring a bit of a further an update on it. But it feels to me that the majority of the public don't know how much of this country is presently covered by these kinds of injunctions. And they're not just taken out by private companies, they've also been taken out by local authorities and by the government. So Highways England, or whatever it's called, you know, they've injuncted a load of roads in order to stop protest. So it's not enough to just legislate against protesters, change the terms of the offence, change the sentencing guidelines for the offences. Let's also injunct loads of the roads as well. And the same goes for like loads and loads of buildings where fossil fuel companies operate out their offices. Around their offices are injuncted. Lots of petrol station forecourts are injuncted. Lots of oil terminals are injuncted. Lots of roads are injuncted. Lots of access roads are injuncted. And lots of grass verges apparently are injuncted. So I mean, I think a lot of people would be very shocked basically if they could understand the scale of what's covered in this country by what is, you know, effectively a privatized, bought and paid for, closed system of so-called justice.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, you don't have to be any sort of legal scholar to understand that a system of justice that's only available to the wealthy is not justice. No. Simple as that. And of course, you know, justice is a value that's really, really important to people. Fairness and the right thing being done is really, really important to people. You see it. Kids are obsessed with fairness, right?
And we teach them to be as well, don't we? Right. We say, be fair.
Yeah, yeah, we do.
Be kind, be fair.
Do. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, people would be outraged to know about this.
Yeah.
But of course, they don't because the media don't cover it. We talk about the courts a lot, actually, and we talk about them primarily as an instrument of oppression against us, against people that want to bring about change. But there's been some good news in the courts as well recently, and that was something I wanted to raise. So there's an oil company that's drilling or wants to drill in the Surrey Hills, right in the middle of sort of posh Britain, the heart of Surrey. And there's a lady called Sarah Finch, who's part of the Weald Action Group, who's been launching a legal procedure against them. Surrey County Council gave the planning go-ahead to expand this oil drilling. But UK planning law, bizarrely, says that you only need to take account of the environmental impacts from constructing that mine, and the impacts of the oil that it brings out are completely irrelevant. That's what UK planning law said. So Sarah Finch took them to court, and it got passed about from court to court, but it ended up in the Supreme Court last month. And the Supreme Court ruled in her favour. So they said any fossil fuel project happening into the UK has to not just account for its physical footprint and the impacts of the project site, but it has to also account for the emissions that it will generate from the fossil fuels it produces. And this is really, really significant. So it was in late June that ruling came out, and it will, it'll probably have, it'll put the brakes on this oil project in Surrey. But in just the couple of weeks since, it's already had an impact on other other fossil fuel projects, and that's really, really exciting. So there was an oil exploration project in Lincolnshire, which sounds like now it's just going to be scrapped because of this. But also the famous Whitehaven coal mine in Cumbria, the coal mine that the government gave a green light to last year or the year before. It's now been found that them approving that coal mine was illegal because it didn't account for the downstream emissions. And so this is just really, really fantastic news. And we've got all the oil licensing in the North Sea, which, whether or not that is, those licenses are scrapped for other reasons, they may well be for this. And because this finding was partially based on EU law, it might have implications beyond the UK too, which is fantastic. It
reminds me of when Friends of the Earth, and I think Plan B was also involved, Tim Crossland, they brought a litigation against the expansion of Heathrow Airport, and that went in the Royal Courts of Justice and was ruled to be a government policy that would be incompatible with meeting Paris targets, and therefore that the state had failed to do due diligence in making sure that their infrastructure policies were going to be compliant with what they'd agreed on an international level. Therefore, it was not a legal government policy for them to put forward. So the whole thing was like squashed. And I remember going there to the courts when that decision came through, and like crying a little bit because it felt so it felt completely sort of unbelievable and unexpected, because you just get used to relentlessly losing everything. And actually what happened with that was that it then got taken on appeal by Heathrow Airport to the Supreme Court, where it was overturned because Heathrow Airport brought like an army of very expensive lawyers. And of course that then ended up in Tim breaking the embargo on the result from the Supreme Court, putting him in contempt of the Supreme Court, and so turning it into this whole debacle. For him it was trying to really expose that. And given that sort of the buck stops with the Supreme Court, these things with appeal, where you hit the end of the road for appeals, and that's where you are in the Supreme Court. It's not just a significant ruling, is it? It must be like kind of a final one, basically, that says this is where it ends. I don't know where there's an appeal that can go beyond that, but it feels to me like it's got enormous implications for other fossil fuel projects, right, in this country.
Yeah, and not just fossil fuel projects. So you talked about airport expansion, and there are sort of parallel cases going on right now to do with roads expansion. So there's an amazing legal campaigner based in Norwich called Andrew Boswell, who is taking the government to court over multiple new road projects because, again, they've completely ignored the additional emissions that building the road will cause through all the cars that use it in the future. And so, our government has a legal obligation to decarbonise and reduce its emissions. So if infrastructure projects are incompatible with that, or simply don't take that into account, then they need to be stopped. And Andrew's been working very hard on a number of court cases over this. But yeah, so it applies it applies across the board, I think, and it's an exciting development because everything we do has immediate impacts in the present and long-term impacts that will play out over decades and decades and decades. And when we're in a time of really, really rapid change, it's hugely important that big national level infrastructure decisions take account of what their long-term impacts will be, and that's a massive change. It's always been, we have a system, a planning system that involves environmental impact assessments and all this. That is designed to, obviously, the powerful always get around it and get to do what they want, but it's designed for a world that we don't live in anymore. So we need to upgrade our legal systems in that respect, and hopefully this case will be an important catalyst for that. So it's nice to be able to talk about a bit of good news for once.
Yeah, do you know there's another law story which we should come back to in another episode actually, which is that somebody in the Northwest has managed to get a court to accept that there's a public nuisance charge to be made against a water company.
Oh, exciting.
And that's really interesting because my understanding of the history of public nuisance as an offence, let's say, is that it was actually originally a law that was supposed to be able to punish somebody who damages the life of a community, which would be a polluting factory, right, or an extractive, industrial activity that's poisoning land or water or people or whatever. And then seeing that flipped and used for the purposes of repressing activists who are fighting companies that are doing these kinds of things has really not, that's been very, very short term, the short time frame, short turnaround, how they've managed to do that over just in very recent years. So I think it's very exciting, sounds like, to be able to sort of get a look back in at sort of using that for what it was originally developed to do, which was to protect communities. So let's I'll go and look into that, and we'll come back on it.
I look forward to that. That sounds really exciting. Before we go though, let's tell us what's up next in terms of looking forward for Extinction Rebellion and our actions and things that people can get involved with.
Yeah, well, I suppose the big thing that people need to pay attention to is the Upgrade Democracy Action, which has been announced. And I'd heard on the grapevine for some time that there was plans to do some kind of an occupation, but the location was unknown. So obviously when that came out, it caused a bit of a stir. There's going to be a large-scale occupation at Windsor, all the fun of the fair, of the unfair, or something. And, that means that there'll be, I guess, something that you would expect from like an Extinction Rebellion occupation, as in like there's going to be people making art and printing stuff, there's going to be people speaking. I think the intention is to bring the usual sort of colour and positivity and peaceful, joyful kind of nature of the occupations that Extinction Rebellion's known for, but it's crucially in this kind of iconic place which has been chosen, I think, partly because of the King's statements that he's made over years and years and years about biodiversity loss, about climate breakdown, about the severity of our sort of peril, the situation that we're in on Earth. And the quote that they used in the press release I thought was very good because it's from his own writing, and it says, "We need a revolution." Obviously now he's the king, maybe that's slightly challenging for him to have that quoted back to him, but nonetheless it is printed in a book, so we can quote it. And we agree, right, that we do need revolutionary change in loads of areas of our society, but always Extinction Rebellion has stood for a democratic upgrade and a systemic address to the failings of our political system, but definitely the ultimate failing of it in our through our eyes, which is that it's actually not capable of doing the things that we need to do. It would be, enough reason, I think, to say there are loads and loads of other problems with it, but the fact that it's structurally incapable of making the changes happen that humanity now needs to survive, I think is coming to the forefront basically with this message about upgrading our democracy. And I think particularly in light of the change of government and the election, some people have contested this as a strategy by saying, well, we've just had an election, so how can you say there isn't a democracy? I've heard that trotted out in courts recently by judges. We've got a functioning democracy. Look, there's just been an election. But actually, the most striking statistic that I've heard about our recent election was that more people stayed at home than voted for the current government. So the most popular decision to make about an election is to not show up. That's got the biggest votes.
That's a bad situation.
Is the stay home vote. So, it's not great to have a party in power that has won such a small share of the vote in order to win such a big majority. That doesn't feel very representative, very fair. It doesn't feel very good to have a Labour Party government now that won less votes than Corbyn did when he lost in the recent past. I think there's a lot of people who have been advocating for or polled as wanting structural and systemic address to our failings of our political system, not least the inherent corruption, the amount of money and lobbying that goes into it to divert it and distract it and drag it in different directions. So there's an awful lot of popular public sentiment before the election for something different that was more inclusive, more representative, and felt more fair and felt like it could be more tuned into real people's lives. So I actually think that whilst people are in that period of election where they're interested in democracy, which, let's be honest, like a lot of the time, it's not very easy to get the British media or the British public to have a serious conversation about what democracy is and isn't, and whether or not we're happy with it. And it's not seen as a sexy subject. So whilst it's high on people's agenda, because we've just had an election, I think it's a great time to shine a light on the third demand, which has always been the revolutionary change that we think we need. So yeah, hope lots of people will come down and join it.
Well, I hope so, because I think, as you say, it's something that is relevant and of interest to absolutely everybody. So it's an important aspect of this crisis to be focusing on, our absence of proper governance that's capable of dealing with our situation. And it'll be a great event, hopefully too, as XR events always are. I always find them just so uplifting. It's so powerful to be there with so many people. I find it really recharges my batteries every few months. So that's great. That's in late August. So keep an eye out on your XR social media channels for more information, and do please come and join us. This is a really, really crucial struggle, and we all need to play our part in it now. Claire will be there. I'm really looking forward to it. The whole News from a World in Flux team will be there. So we'll see you there, and we'll see you on another episode.